She stood at the door, her reflection flashing back at her just before it swung open. Inside, chandeliers glowed, silver gleamed, and conversations hushed into something colder the moment she stepped in. She wasn't dressed to impress. Steady, composed, and dignified, carrying a reservation she had earned days earlier. Yet the room shifted, stares cutting sharper than words. There. The waiter's pause, the silence pressing against her. All of it asked the same question. What is she doing here? But what no one expected was how her quiet defiance would turn the entire restaurant upside down. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The glass door reflected her own face back at her for a brief second before it swung open. The restaurant glowed with soft amber lights, a warmth designed to soothe the wealthy clientele that dined there. Polished brass handles, gleaming marble floors, and hushed voices filled the space. The scent of seared steak and aged wine drifted through the air, mixing with the faint sound of piano music from the far corner. She stepped inside quietly, her heels clicking against the floor, and immediately felt the pause in the air that always seemed to follow her in places like this. Heads turned, eyes darted quickly before returning to their plates. Nothing was said, yet the shift was unmistakable. She wore a navy blue dress, plain but pressed, paired with a simple coat folded neatly over her arm. Her bag was not from a designer. Labeled, but it was sturdy and well kept. Her hair was pulled back, not elaborate, not meant to impress. She had come here not for spectacle, but for a meal, a reservation she had carefully made days in advance. Yet she knew even before reaching the host stand that her presence had unsettled the room. The Mater D lifted his gaze. Professional. Smile fixed in place, though his eyes flickered with a hesitation he tried to hide. She offered her name calmly, her tone measured, steady. He glanced at the book, found the reservation, and nodded briskly. His hand motioned for a waiter to assist. Her. She waited, clutching her coat, aware of the silence pressing in behind her back. It was not the first time she felt this. Grocery stores, boardrooms, banks, even sidewalks. Sometimes the quietest spaces screamed the loudest. That lingering question in the air, what is she doing here? She had grown used to it, though never immune. Tonight was no different. She inhaled softly, reminding herself of her own worth, of the years of work and sacrifice that had brought her to stand with quiet dignity. In a place that rarely welcomed her reflection, the waiter approached with a stiff posture, his expression polite but cool. He was young, perhaps early 20s, crisp white shirt tucked perfectly, black tie pulled to his throat. His eyes flicked over her quickly, a scan rather than a greeting, as though calculating something. He picked up a menu from the stand, but did not step aside to lead her. Instead, he hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The pause stretched long enough that she felt the attention of nearby diners pressing closer. She kept her chin lifted, refusing to shrink. The piano played on, notes rolling over polished wood and velvet curtains, but the music seemed distant to her. She could hear her own heart beat louder. She thought of her grandmother's words, spoken often in kitchens and porches, warnings wrapped in wisdom. You don't need to raise your voice. Oh, child, your presence is enough. Those words steadied her now. She stood tall, even as she felt the unspoken tension weaving through the room. The waiter finally spoke. His voice measured in that way people use when they mean to sound professional, but cannot conceal reluctance. Are you sure you have a reservation? His question was sharp, though framed as neutral. She nodded, steady, offering her name again. The Mater D, still within earshot, confirmed it quickly. The waiter gave a curt nod, but did not move, his body still blocking the path. She felt the moment stretch. A handful of diners stole glances, some with curiosity, others with subtle disdain. Her jaw tightened. She had walked into many rooms where the first assumption was that she was out of place. But she would not step back. Not tonight. She had worked too hard, endured too much, to keep folding herself smaller so others could remain comfortable. She waited silently, coat draped over. Her eyes steady on the young man before her. He shifted again, visibly unsettled by her composure. For all the stares, all the whispers, she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that refused to break. The restaurant around her buzzed softly, but for her, time slowed. Every second waited with the choice she would make next. Would she demand the table she had reserved? Would she turn away and swallow another small humiliation? Or would something or someone finally shift the balance? The room seemed to lean in, waiting to see how the story would unfold. The waiter's smile barely moved, stretched just enough to mimic courtesy, but not enough to hide the rigidity in his jaw. He still held the menu in his hand as if it were a shield, pressed against his side, his eyes darting once to the mater d' before settling back on her. The silence between them thickened, broken only by the muted clink of silverware and low murmurs from tables nearby. Finally, he spoke, his words wrapped in a tone that tried to sound professional but dripped with resistance. "I'm afraid this section is reserved for our regular guests," he said. His voice was even carefully measured, but the meaning landed like a slap. Her reservation had been confirmed. She had heard the mater d' say her name, had seen the inked letters on the page. Yet here stood this young man, erect, polished, acting as though her presence was an intrusion. His eyes did not linger long on her face. Instead, they moved past her, toward the other diners, as though gauging their reactions, as though protecting their comfort was part of his duty. She tightened her grip on her coat, the fabric creasing beneath her fingers. A ripple of awareness moved through the room. The closest tables had quieted, forks paused mid-air, conversations suspended. A few pairs of eyes looked on openly, while others flicked away quickly, pretending not to notice but unable to resist watching from the corners of their vision. The pianist in the corner continued to play, the melody light and careless. A strange contrast to the weight pressing against her chest. The waiter shifted his stance, shoulders squared as if preparing for a confrontation he did not want, but felt justified in forcing. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in our lounge," he added, lowering his voice, but not his edge. "It's casual, relaxed, better suited for certain guests." The words were carefully chosen, rehearsed, yet unmistakable in their intent. Politeness was the mask, but rejection was the blade. Her throat tightened. Not from surprise, this was far from the first time she had been told where she did or did not belong, but from the sting of being dressed down in front of strangers. She could feel the heat of humiliation rising along her neck. She thought briefly of walking out, of sparing herself the fight, but another voice, quieter and steadier, rose within her. She remembered her grandmother again, the stories told in the stillness of night about standing firm, about never allowing someone else's refusal to become the final word. She lifted her chin, her gaze locking on the waiter with calm resolve. "I have a reservation," she said simply. Her tone was low but steady, enough to reclaim the air that had been taken from her. The mater d' glanced up, visibly uncomfortable now, caught between the insistence of his staff and the truth written plainly in the reservation book. He adjusted his glasses, looking from her to the waiter, then back again. The waiter's smile faltered for the first time, cleared his throat, still searching for a way to press his point without breaking the veneer of professionalism. "Understand," he murmured, "but we do have standards to maintain." The word hung heavy, as though it carried more weight than just etiquette. It was a word she had heard countless times before, used to disguise exclusion in polished syllables. Her eyes swept the room briefly, catching glimpses of sympathy on some faces, discomfort on others, disdain on a few. Every reaction was a mirror of the society she had navigated her whole life. She stood straighter, refusing to let her posture betray the storm tightening inside. The coat on her arm slipped slightly, and she adjusted it with deliberate grace, a small act of control, in a moment designed to strip her of it. The waiter's refusal was no longer just about a table. It was about history pressing itself into the present, about the invisible barriers she had pushed against since childhood. The room seemed to conspire to make her feel smaller, but she would not shrink. Not here, not now. The mater d' opened his mouth as if to intervene, but hesitation stalled him. The young waiter's eyes flickered with something like triumph, emboldened by the silence of authority. He gestured faintly toward the lounge again, lowering his voice just enough that only she and a few nearby could hear. It really would be best. The humiliation was complete in its intent. She could feel it settle like a stone in her stomach. Yet beneath the sting there was a rising current of strength, the kind that had carried her through every other door that tried to close. On her, she inhaled slowly, steadying herself, the piano still playing on, the clink of glass resuming at a nearby table as though the world were content to let the moment pass. But she knew it would not pass so easily. The refusal had already etched itself into the air. And nothing in this room would remain the same. The air inside the restaurant had shifted into something heavy, almost suffocating. The waiter's refusal had not been loud, not shouted, not crude, but it had been public, and that made it worse. Words had carried just enough edge to cut her down while maintaining the thin veneer of professionalism that allowed others to pretend they hadn't heard what was plainly said. Now the silence in the room told a story of its own. Conversations resumed in murmurs, but the rhythm had changed, the tones hushed, watchful. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, some lingering openly, others flickering quickly. Away when she turned her head, she remained where she was. Coat still draped across her arm, her bag balanced carefully against her hip. The maître d' had not yet spoken. The waiter stood stiff, his body angled just enough to block her path forward. Around them, diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of the scene unfolding at the edge of their candlelit tables. At one corner, an older couple looked on with faint frowns, perhaps offended at the disruption. At another, a young woman stirred her wineglass slowly, eyes darting between her companion and the woman left standing, as if silently questioning whether to intervene or to stay silent like everyone else. The humiliation lay not only in the refusal, but in the stage it created. To be dismissed in private was one thing. To be dismissed while others looked on, pretending their discomfort was neutrality, was another kind of wound entirely. She could hear snippets of voices, the rustle of napkins, the clearing of throats. Each sound amplified in her ears, as though the room itself was waiting for her to decide what came next. Her body remained still, but inside conflict churned. One part of her wanted to turn around, to leave with dignity before the sting could burrow any deeper. Another part wanted to plant herself firmly in place, to demand recognition of her reservation, her right to sit where anyone else could. She thought of her grandmother again, of the quiet strength she had always praised. Dignity, her grandmother once said, is not given to you, it is claimed, even in the face of those who would rather strip it away. Yet at this moment, claiming it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. If she raised her voice, would they say she was making a scene? If she walked away, would it seem like an admission that she did not belong? The weight of history pressed against her, every unspoken judgment from her past rising to the surface. She remembered boardrooms where her contributions were questioned, stores where she was followed, classrooms where teachers assumed less of her before she even opened her mouth. And now this restaurant, just another door that closed, another reminder that she was seen as an intrusion in spaces that dressed themselves in velvet and candlelight. The piano continued to play, notes floating through the tense air as if mocking the quiet struggle at the center of the room. The maître d' shuffled his papers, avoiding her gaze. The waiter's eyes were cold but uncertain, as though he knew the line he was towing but believed no one would hold him accountable for crossing it. And all around, the diners played their part, some pretending not to notice, some staring with curiosity, and a few with a look that bordered on satisfaction. As though they approved of her exclusion, her breath came slow, deliberate, her chest rising and falling against the weight of so many gazes. She wanted to sit. She wanted to eat her meal like any other guest, without carrying the burden of other people's discomfort. Yet to insist would mean placing herself at the center of a room that had already decided what she was worth. She remained frozen, caught between two choices, each one sharp in its own way. The discomfort of others was almost louder than the words spoken to her. It was in the way someone coughed softly and shifted their chair, in the way a fork clinked too hard against porcelain as if to cover the silence. It was in the way a child whispered a question to their parent, quickly hushed with a shake of the head. Indifference, too, carried its own sting. To be invisible in pain, to be dismissed as though nothing unjust had occurred. It's 'cause as cutting as the refusal itself. Time seemed to stretch, measured not by minutes but by the thudding of her own pulse in her ears. She thought again of leaving, of sparing herself the burn of those stairs. But something deeper urged her to hold still, to remain rooted in this moment, as unbearable as it felt. She had done nothing wrong. She had come prepared, made her reservation, walked in with dignity. The wrong did not belong to her, no matter how many eyes tried to push the blame onto her presence. The coat on her arm grew heavier, her shoulders stiff beneath the invisible weight of scrutiny. She lifted her gaze and swept the room, meeting the eyes of those who did not turn away quickly enough. For a heartbeat, silence deepened. She did not speak, but her stillness spoke for her. And though she remained seated at the edge of humiliation, there was something in her gaze that refused to bend. The decision of whether to stay or leave was still hers to make. And that choice, quiet, deliberate, unbroken, was the only dignity she would not allow anyone to strip from her. The stairs pressed against her like an invisible wall, and in the midst of that suffocating silence, her mind slipped away, searching for steadiness somewhere else. It found her grandmother's voice, warm and steady, woven into the fabric of her earliest memories. It was the voice that had carried her through childhood nights when the world felt heavy, the voice that reminded her of who she was long before anyone else tried to decide it for her. She heard it now as clearly as if the old woman were seated beside her at the Martyr D's stand, whispering strength into her ear. Her grandmother had been the kind of woman who walked with quiet purpose, who carried herself upright even when the world tried to bend her low. She remembered sitting at her feet on wooden porches, listening to stories told in a rhythm as steady as the rocking chair that creaked beneath her. Stories of doors closed in her face, of sidewalks crossed to avoid her, of jobs offered with conditions that cut at dignity. Yet each story was not told with bitterness but with a fierce calm, as though the act of surviving it had become its own kind of triumph. She could still recall one particular night, a storm beating against the windows, when her grandmother told her of the bakery in town that once refused to serve her. She had stood in line like anyone else, money folded neatly in her palm, only to be told when she reached the counter that her kind was not welcome. She remembered her grandmother's words, "Child, the hardest part was not the refusal. It was the silence of the others in line." Their eyes dropped, their mouths shut. That silence told me just as much as the words did. It was that same silence she felt echoing in this restaurant now. It's the weight of indifference pressing harder than outright hostility. Her grandmother never raised her voice in those stories. She described them with a matter-of-fact tone, as though recounting weather patterns or family chores. But beneath each account was the unshakable truth. Dignity was not something handed out by gatekeepers. It was something you carried, something you refused to set down, even when it was tested. "You don't have to fight every battle, child," her grandmother used to say. "But you do have to stand inside yourself strong enough that they can't take what matters most." She remembered to the stories of triumph, though they were quieter than the pain. The time her grandmother walked back to that bakery months later and bought bread anyway, not out of forgiveness, but to prove to herself that the door no longer had power over her. The time she marched with neighbors, holding signs that declared worth in the simplest of words. The time she sat across from a city official, refusing to leave until he signed the papers that gave her community clean water. Access. These were not tales of grandeur, not victories written in history books, but in the lineage of her family they were milestones of survival and self-respect. Now, standing in the middle of the restaurant, with her coat clutched in her arm, she felt those memories settle into her bones. She thought of the way her grandmother's eyes used to fix on her. Sharp but kind, drilling in the lesson that she would walk into rooms that doubted her, sit in chairs that others tried to pull out from under her, and face stares that burned with judgment. "But you, child," her grandmother would say, "you don't shrink. You don't let them write your story for you." The humiliation of the waiter's refusal, the sidelong glances of strangers, the tightening of her throat, these were not new. They were chapters in the same long story her grandmother had lived. Before her, the same story told again and again through generations. And just as her grandmother endured, carrying her quiet resilience like a shield, so too could she. The piano's melody seemed to fade into the background as she stood in the memory's glow. She could almost smell her grandmother's kitchen. The scent of collard greens simmering on the stove, the faint trace of soap from freshly scrubbed hands. She could feel the warmth of those evenings when lessons were passed down not as lectures, but as living truth. Her grandmother was long gone, yet in this moment her presence was as real as the marble floors beneath her. The strength of those stories steadied her breath. The sting of the waiter's words had not vanished, but it no longer held her hostage. She was not just a lone woman singled out in a room of strangers. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, the carrier of resilience that stretched backward through time. The restaurant, with its velvet chairs and polished silver, could not erase that. She inhaled, lifted her chin, and steadied her shoulders. For a moment, she almost whispered aloud the words her grandmother had given her. Dignity is not what they allow you. It's what you decide to keep. The memory rekindled in her heart, a flame against the cold stares around her. And with it came the certainty that she would not walk out of this room diminished. From the far end of the dining room, a figure began to move with deliberate calm. The owner of the restaurant, a man whose presence carried weight in every step, approached the front where the scene had quietly unfolded. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, dressed in a dark tailored suit that spoke less of fashion and more of long habit. His hair, silver at the temples, was combed neatly back, and his posture carried the dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect without raising his voice. The low murmur of conversation seemed to thin out as he advanced, as though even the air made room for his arrival. He had been alerted by the sight of a table that remained conspicuously empty despite a name written neatly in the reservation book. He was not a man who ignored details. In his restaurant, details were everything. The angle of the cutlery, the temperature of the wine, the flow of service from arrival to dessert. An empty table meant something had gone wrong, and that was not something he tolerated. The waiter, still standing with the stiffness of someone defending a position, straightened as the owner drew closer. His polished shoes clicked softly on the marble, the faintest echo beneath the music that still played. When he reached the host stand, his eyes moved first to the woman waiting quietly, coat still resting across her arm. There was no visible reaction in his face, but his gaze lingered long enough to suggest he was taking in more than just her presence. Why is this table still unseated? His voice was not raised, but it carried through the space with clarity. It was the kind of voice that made even the most confident staff straighten their spines. The maître d' shifted uncomfortably, fumbling with his ledger as though searching for an answer already written down. But it was the young waiter who spoke first. There seems to be a misunderstanding, the waiter began, his tone controlled, but the edge of defensiveness was clear. He avoided looking directly at her now, instead focusing on the owner, as though hoping his authority would shield him from scrutiny. His guest reservation could perhaps be accommodated in the lounge. It might be more appropriate. The words were chosen carefully, shaped to sound professional, but beneath them lay the same refusal that had already cut her once. The owner's gaze did not shift from the waiter immediately. He studied him in silence, allowing the weight of that choice of words to hang in the air. The diners closest to the stand had gone completely still. Their forks paused above plates, their glasses set down quietly on tables. Even the pianist in the corner seemed to play more softly, as though instinctively lowering his notes to let the silence speak louder. The woman felt the attention intensify. The refusal had already been public, but now the arrival of the owner had turned it into a spectacle. Every eye seemed fixed on this small exchange, though no one spoke. The room itself held its breath, waiting to see which way the scales of power would tip. She stood rooted to the spot, shoulders squared, her grandmother's words still steadying her heart. The waiter continued, sensing perhaps that silence alone would not protect him. Standards are important, he added, and we have to ensure the right experience for our guests. He said it almost confidently now. Convinced he was defending the reputation of the restaurant, the owner finally turned his head, his eyes resting on the woman once more. This time, There was no mistaking the shift in his expression. His brow furrowed slightly, his lips pressed into a line not of disapproval toward her, but of something else, entirely recognition, perhaps, or memory. He looked at her as though he had seen her before, though years and distance stood between that recollection and this moment. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low but steady, directed toward her now. She held his gaze, refusing to shrink away, and answered, with nothing more than the calm clarity of truth, "I have a reservation. My name is written there." Her tone was not pleading, not angry, simply firm. The Mater nodded quickly, fumbling again through the book. "Yes, sir, her name is indeed listed." His voice cracked slightly under the tension. A silence followed that seemed to stretch across the entire room. The owner inhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, then exhaled, as though the decision had already formed in his mind. His eyes flicked once more to the waiter, and in that look was all the authority of a man who had built not only a restaurant, but a reputation on how people were treated within its walls. The room leaned forward, invisible, yet palpable. Diners who had chosen indifference now watched openly, the drama of the moment pulling them in against their will. Some faces showed discomfort, others a quiet curiosity. And still, a few bore the smugness of those who thought they already knew how this story would end. Yet the suspense was undeniable. The woman stood in the middle of it all, steady and silent, her dignity intact even as her heart raced. She did not know what the owner would decide, only that his presence carried the power to either deepen the wound or shift it entirely. The waiter's stiff smile faltered just slightly as the seconds stretched on. The room, with all its velvet chairs and candle-lit tables, waited as though frozen in a single collective breath, hovering at the edge of revelation. The owner stood, still for a moment longer, his silver hair catching the glow of the chandeliers above, his gaze fixed steadily on the woman who had been left standing too long. The waiter's words still hovered in the air, but the silence that followed had grown thick, almost unbearable. Every table leaned, invisible though it was, toward this quiet confrontation. Then, with a movement that no one expected, the owner stepped forward, past the Mater, past the rigid waiter, until he stood directly in front of her. The shift in the room was immediate. Diners stiffened, forks lowered to plates, glasses of wine hovered midair. Some tilted their heads subtly, desperate not to miss what would happen next. The woman herself braced quietly, uncertain if this man's presence would become yet another barrier, or if, somehow, he would break the pattern she had seen repeated so many times. Then the unthinkable happened. He bent, his body upright and dignified only a second earlier, lowered into a deep bow before her. His suit creased as he leaned forward, his hands resting briefly at his sides as his head inclined with deliberate grace. The gesture was not rushed, not careless, but carried with it a sincerity that echoed in every corner of the dining room. A murmur rippled across the tables like a wave striking stone. A bow was not a gesture anyone expected in this place, certainly not from the owner whose name was synonymous with refinement, whose reputation had been built on commanding respect, not giving it away. Yet here he was, offering her not just an apology, but a public acknowledgement of wrong, and in doing so, he froze the room in astonishment. When he straightened, his voice followed, low but clear, carrying the authority of decades in business, and the weight of genuine regret. "Madam," he said, his words deliberate, "I must apologize to you. You were wronged here, and that should never have happened within these walls. You are a guest of this house, and it is my honor to welcome you properly." The waiter blinked, his stiff smile collapsing into shock. His hands fidgeted at his sides, unsure whether to step back or stammer a defense. The Mater lowered his eyes, shame settling into his features, and the woman, who had stood so still under the weight of humiliation, felt the breath catch in her throat. She had never expected this, an apology perhaps if she pressed hard enough, a correction maybe if she forced the issue, but a bow, something so rare, so humbling from a man in his position, was beyond anything she imagined. Around them, the diners shifted uncomfortably. Some faces reflected admiration, others disbelief. A few whispered to their companions, their words swallowed quickly under the piano's melody, which now seemed to falter and slow, as though even the musician was caught in the moment. For once, no one could pretend not to notice. The owner's eyes did not waver as he looked at her. There was recognition there, as though his bow had not only been an apology for this night, but for something deeper, something long unacknowledged. His voice softened slightly as he added, "Please, allow me to correct this.
The finest table
Is yours tonight, and the error committed by my staff will be remembered, not ignored." Her chest rose and fell as she steadied herself. Part of her wanted to look away, to dismiss the gesture as spectacle, but something in his tone carried more than performance. There was sincerity in it, something that spoke not just to her, but to the room itself, as though he meant for everyone to learn from this single bow. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his face paling as though the weight of the gesture pressed on him more than words ever could. His protest died in his throat. He could not undo what had been done, nor could he erase the moment when the authority he expected to shield him bent instead toward the woman he had refused. She did not speak right away. The power of silence was her own choice now, and for the first time since she entered the restaurant, she felt it was on her side. She finally nodded. It was small, measured, but it carried all the strength of her lineage, all the quiet resilience her grandmother had spoken of. She allowed herself to accept, not as a gift, not as a favor, but as a rightful acknowledgement. The room exhaled, though quietly, almost guiltily. Conversations resumed in strained whispers, the moment too striking to pass without comment, but too fragile to break openly. Diners leaned toward one another, their voices low, their expressions mixed. Yet no one could deny what they had just witnessed. The man who owned the restaurant, who set the tone for its reputation, chosen not to protect his staff, not to sidestep discomfort, but to lower himself before the woman who had been wronged. For her, the humiliation of a few minutes earlier had not vanished, still lingered like a bruise, but it no longer stood unchallenged. The bow had shifted something, not only in the room, but within her. For once, the weight was not hers alone to carry. The burden of dignity had been recognized, and though she had not asked for it, she felt the power of having it restored in a way so public that no one present could deny its significance. The owner gestured gently toward the interior of the dining room, his hand extended as though offering a promise rather than an order. And for the first time since she had stepped through the restaurant doors, the silence around her was no longer heavy with dismissal. It was heavy with reverence. When the owner straightened from his bow, the weight of the gesture lingered in, the air like incense, fragrant and inescapable. Yet the look on his face suggested that this was more than a simple apology offered to restore decorum. His eyes, sharp even in age, studied her with an intensity that unsettled her. It was not the scrutiny of someone doubting her place. It was not the cold measure of a gatekeeper deciding worth. It was something else entirely, an echo of memory, a recognition that stirred behind his steady gaze. For a heartbeat, she wondered if she had imagined it, the way his brow softened, the way his lips parted as though a name hovered just behind them. She had never met this man before, of that she was certain. And yet, as he looked at her, it was as though he saw not only her, but the trace of someone else carried in her features. Someone whose story had crossed his path long ago. He spoke her name slowly, carefully, as though tasting it against memory. The sound of it carried across the hushed tables, soft but deliberate. Diners turned their heads, surprised at the familiarity in his tone. He repeated it once, more firmly, and his voice lowered, almost reverent. "You are her granddaughter, aren't you?" Her chest tightened. She had not spoken of her grandmother to anyone in this room, yet the name, unspoken between them, weighed heavy. The owner's eyes had widened, his posture less formal now, touched by something closer to awe. He did not wait for her answer before continuing, his words slipping out in a half-whisper, half-confession. "I remember her. I remember your family." The waiter beside him stiffened, his confusion evident. He had no idea what story had been awakened, what history now bridged the space between his employer and the woman he had refused. The diners Closest leaned subtly forward, straining to catch the words. For once, curiosity outweighed etiquette. The woman herself stood frozen, her grandmother's voice still alive in her chest, and now here was this stranger, this man of power, summoning her memory into the present. It was disorienting, almost surreal, to hear the lineage that had steadied her in silence now spoken aloud by someone outside her blood. The owner's voice dropped further, intimate yet unshakable. I knew her. Your grandmother, she once worked near here years ago. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her strength. She carried herself with the kind of dignity people couldn't ignore, even when they tried to. I was just a boy then, but I never forgot her face. And now, here you are. The room seemed to hold even tighter. Every word he spoke reshaped, the scene peeling back layers of meaning that no one had expected when she first stepped through the door. The refusal, the humiliation, had been stark enough. But this thread connecting her to a past he remembered shifted everything into another dimension. Her throat constricted. Though she managed to keep her composure, to be recognized, not as a stranger out of place, not as a name on a reservation list, but as someone belonging to a story already carried in memory, it was a reversal so profound it left her momentarily adrift. The waiter faltered, opening his mouth to protest or excuse, but the owner's raised hand silenced him. His attention remained fixed on her, the recognition burning like a lamp that refused to be dimmed. It is not chance that brought you here tonight, he said, his words no longer for the restaurant, but for her alone. I see her in you, the same eyes, the same way you stand when challenged. It has been many years, but I could not mistake it. I owe your family more than I can ever repay. She felt the tension in her shoulders soften, though her heart raced. Round her, the whispers grew louder, not daring to speak her grandmother's name, but buzzing with the electricity of revelation. She did not move, did not speak, but allowed the recognition to wash over her. It was not the bow alone that had stilled the room. It was this deeper tie, this whisper of history that suddenly made her presence undeniable. In that moment, the humiliation she had endured minutes earlier seemed small against the weight of what was being revealed. Her grandmother's legacy had entered the room like a ghost, commanding respect where she herself had been denied it. The owner's bow was no longer a gesture of courtesy. It was the settling of an old debt, public acknowledgement of a dignity carried forward through generations. And as she stood there, his eyes steady, she realized that the gaze of the diners had changed too. They no longer looked at her with suspicion or discomfort. They looked at her with the awareness that they were witnessing something larger than a single refusal, something that reached backward through time and now unfolded before them. She was not just a woman denied a table. She was the heir to a resilience already known, already remembered. And no one could erase that truth. The owner's words lingered in the air, charged with recognition, but he did not stop there. As he studied her face, something deeper seemed to stir in him, pulling forward memories that had long been buried beneath the daily rhythms of business. He cleared his throat, his voice lower now, as though speaking more to her than to the curious diners who strained to listen. It is not only your grandmother I remember, he said slowly. Your father, too, he was a man the city has forgotten, though it should not have. Her breath caught. Few people ever spoke of her father outside of family, and when they did, it was often in passing, as if the scope of his work were too ordinary to name. Yet here was a stranger, a man of stature, summoning his memory with an almost reverent tone. The room itself seemed to shift again, the walls drawing closer as though even the chandeliers leaned in to hear. The owner's eyes drifted for a moment, as if seeing something beyond the polished tables and velvet chairs. I was young then, still learning my way. This city was building itself upward, clawing into the sky with towers and monuments. And there was your father, hands calloused, shoulders bent beneath stone, laying brick upon brick, day after day.
Yes.
He was one of the masons, who gave this city its spine, quiet, steady, never asking to be seen, but without men like him, there would be no skyline. The image of her father returned to her with startling clarity. She remembered the dust clinging to his clothes when he came home in the evenings, The scent of mortars that never seemed to wash fully from his skin, the silence of a man who gave more of himself to his work than the world ever cared to acknowledge. He had never sought credit, never demanded thanks, yet she had always known how much of him existed in the stones around them. To hear another man name it aloud in this room felt both painful and profound. He worked on the courthouse downtown, the owner continued, his eyes now fixed on her as though urging her to see what he saw. I remember because I walked by it every day on my way to school. They were laying the great arches, heavy blocks that seemed impossible for men to lift. I remember watching him guide the younger laborers, showing them how to balance weight, how to keep the lines true. Even then, though I was only a boy, I understood that what he was building would last longer than all of us. She felt her throat tighten as the picture grew sharper. She remembered her father's voice, low and worn, telling her to notice the details in every structure. Look up at the lines, he used to say, when they walked through the city together. If the stones hold, the people can live their lives. Inside, without fear, that's our work holding steady so others can stand tall. His words had shaped her understanding of dignity, of effort that mattered even when unseen. Now, hearing them echoed by a man who had watched him from afar, she felt something swell inside her. You didn't? It was not pride alone, but the ache of recognition. Long delayed. For years, her father's labor had gone uncredited, the plaques on the buildings bearing the names of architects and financiers. Never the men who sweated under the sun to make them real, but here at last, in a place she least expected, someone remembered. Someone knew. The owner's voice softened further, carrying the weight of confession. I never told him I should have. I should have thanked him, men like your father carried this city on their backs, but they slipped into shadows while others took the credit, and I fear we allowed it. I fear I allowed it. His eyes glimmered with something unsaid, a mixture of guilt and gratitude. She swallowed hard, her coat still hanging limp on her arm. The humiliation she had felt at the door moments earlier had not vanished, but it had been overtaken by something else entirely. Her father's presence seemed to fill the room now, larger than the velvet chairs, larger than the chandeliers, larger even than the silence of those who stared without words. His life, his work, had not been erased. It lived in the arches, the stones, the very framework of the city, and now his name enwritten. Unengraved was spoken in reverence by a man who remembered. The diners, too, seemed to feel the shift. Some lowered their eyes, others watched. Her with a new kind of attentiveness. What had begun as an act of dismissal was now unraveling into something that demanded reflection from everyone present. The refusal had been sharp, but the recognition was sharper still. Cutting through the surface to reveal a truth none could ignore, she was not merely a guest who had been denied a seat. She was the daughter of a man whose unseen labor had shaped the very foundation beneath their feet. In the silence that followed, she drew in a long, steady breath. The weight of her father's memory settled not as burden, but as anchor. She stood taller, her chin lifted as though his strength rose in her spine. The owner's bow had honored her dignity. His words had honored her bloodline. And though the night had begun with humiliation, it now carried the undeniable presence of a legacy too deeply rooted to be erased. The owner's voice grew quieter, almost reflective, as if the memories he now carried forward were not rehearsed but drawn from a place he rarely let himself visit. He looked at her as though she were not just a woman standing in his restaurant, but a doorway to the past. The diners leaned closer without meaning to, their wine glasses paused in midair, their forks left hovering above plates. It was not just curiosity now, but a sense that something extraordinary, something fragile and raw was about to be spoken. I remember him most clearly. The owner began, not with stone or mortar in his hands, but with fire all around us. His eyes, which had moments before been sharp and commanding, now softened, clouded by the weight of memory. I was 12 years old. My parents and I lived in a narrow house, the kind built quickly after the war, crowded together with dozens of others. The walls were thin, the wiring old. One night, just past midnight, I woke to smoke filling my room. The curtains were glowing red, and the air was too thick to breathe. My mother's voice screamed my name, but she was trapped on, The stairwell with my father. The fire had spread too quickly. The room around him was silent. Even the piano in the corner had stopped, the musician's hands suspended above the keys. Sensing the gravity of what was unfolding, I remember thinking we would die there, the owner continued, his voice roughening slightly. Neighbors had gathered on the street, shouting, but no one could get inside, and then he came, your father. I recognized him even then, though I had seen him only in passing on work sites, walking home covered in dust. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for anyone else. He broke down the side door with his shoulder, and he charged straight into the flames. The woman's heart pounded in her chest as the image of her father formed in her mind, not only the builder of arches and towers, but the rescuer who had never told this story to his family. Her eyes stung, but she held her composure, listening as the owner drew breath. Steadying himself, he carried my mother out first, he said, his voice trembling with the memory. Her nightdress was singed, her hair blackened with soot. But she was alive because of him. He went back in for my father, who had collapsed from the smoke. I can still see a cheer father dragging him out by the arms, coughing so violently I thought he would collapse himself. Still, even then, he turned back once more. I screamed for him not to, but he went up the stairs and brought me down on his own shoulders. I remember clinging to him, my skin blistering from the heat, the sound of timbers crashing behind us. He carried me into the street and set me down in my mother's arms. He saved all three of us that night. The owner's words hung in the air, heavy with reverence. His eyes glistened now, and though he straightened his posture as though embarrassed by his own emotion, he did not look away from her. I never repaid him, he said softly. How could I? He disappeared back into his life, and the city went on as if nothing had happened. No newspaper wrote his name. No plaque marked his heroism. He didn't ask for recognition, and I was too young, too powerless to give it. But I've carried that night with me all my life. Everything I built, every success I had, lived in the shadow of that debt. Without him, my family would have been ashes in that house. I have eaten thousands of meals since then, hosted countless guests, yet not one night has passed where I haven't thought of the man who gave me the chance to grow into the life I have. The silence that followed was absolute. The waiter who had denied her stood pale, his eyes wide, his posture unraveling. Diners who had earlier shifted with discomfort now sat with reverence, their judgments dismantled by the revelation. And she, standing there with her coat still folded across her, arm felt as though the ground had tilted beneath her. Her father, so often unspoken in public memory, had been living all this time in the quiet recollection of a man who now bowed before her in front of strangers. The owner's voice lowered further, nearly breaking. I bowed to you not simply because my staff wronged you tonight. I bowed because I have owed your family my life since I was a boy. I will never stop owing it. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she could not breathe. In this grand room filled with velvet and chandeliers, her father's presence was alive again, his sacrifice remembered not in secret but proclaimed aloud. The humiliation she had endured only minutes earlier was now swept aside by a truth too powerful to be diminished. She was no longer standing alone at the edge of rejection. She was standing in the center of recognition, carrying the weight of her father's legacy, a legacy that could not be denied, not by any waiter, not by any silent stare. The words of the owner seemed to echo through the room long after he had finished speaking. The revelation of fire, of rescue, of a debt that had lingered across decades was too large to ignore. The woman stood steady, her coat still pressed against her arm, her heart pounding with the sudden weight of her father's name alive again in this place. Around her, the diners remained silent, stunned by the story that had been laid bare. It was in that silence that the waiter, same young man who had so confidently dismissed her minutes before, began to unravel. His posture, once so straight, seemed to collapse slightly under the weight of what he had just witnessed. He had spoken with certainty earlier, wielding the thin weapon of professionalism to disguise exclusion. But now that shield faltered. His polished shoes shifted on the marble floor, the movement small but telling. The stiffness in his shoulders, once meant to project authority, now looked like the rigidity of fear. His jaw tightened and loosened again, as though he could not decide whether to hold his composure. or let the shame settle visibly on his face. The owner had not reprimanded him directly, had not raised his voice or stripped him of his place in front of the diners. Instead, the story itself had done the work, delivering a lesson so heavy it pressed against the waiter's chest more forcefully than anger ever could. To stand beside the woman he had refused, hearing that her father had once carried the very man he served out of a burning house, was a reversal he could not disguise. Every polished mannerism, every rehearsed phrase, now felt hollow against the truth that had been spoken. His eyes darted to the diners, who had shifted their gazes subtly toward him. No one said his name, no one accused him aloud, but he could feel their judgment as clearly as if it had been whispered in his ear. The same mouths that had once sipped wine while ignoring her humiliation now pressed closed in disapproval, their silence heavy and unmistakable. It was the kind of silence that burned hotter than words. The waiter's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His hands, which had been folded neatly at his sides, twitched against his trousers as if searching for something to hold on to. He tried to form words, perhaps an excuse or an apology, but none came. His lips parted and closed again, the sound catching before it could leave his throat. He looked at the owner for guidance, for rescue. But the man who had just bowed remained still, his gaze fixed only on the woman before him. No lifeline would be thrown. This was a moment the waiter had to face alone. For the first time that evening, the waiter truly saw her. Not as a guest he could redirect, not as a name he could brush aside, but as the daughter of a man whose courage had shaped another's life, whose legacy still reverberated decades later. Her quiet composure, her refusal to bend, even when humiliated, now stood in stark contrast to his faltering stance. The dignity he had denied her was undeniable now. It revealed the smallness of his own actions with painful clarity. He shifted. Again, the polished surface of his uniform no longer a symbol of professionalism, but a reminder of how shallow appearance could be. His cheeks burned with heat he could not control. The lesson landed harder with every second that passed, not because someone had shouted it into his ears, but because the weight of truth had made it impossible to stand tall. He had thought himself the gatekeeper of standards. Instead, he had become the one who failed to recognize the worth standing in front of him. She did not look at him. Her attention remained on the owner, on the memory of her father resurrected in the story just spoken. And perhaps that was the sharpest edge of all, that she did not need to condemn him. Her silence was enough, left him to wrestle with himself, to feel the collapse of certainty in his own chest. The piano in the corner began again, the notes hesitant at first, as though the musician himself was unsure whether music belonged in this moment. The clink of silverware resumed at distant tables, but the weight in the air had not lifted. It pressed especially hard on the young man who now stood exposed. Every detail of his polished exterior cracked beneath the shame he could not hide. He drew in a breath, shallow and uneven, his eyes fixed on the ground. The lesson had been delivered. Without a single direct word of rebuke, it had been written in the story of fire and survival. In the bow of an old man who owed his life to the very family the waiter had dismissed, and in the unwavering silence of the woman who stood taller than anyone else in the room. It was not reprimand that had broken him, but recognition of the dignity he had failed to see, and the truth that had made his actions too small to defend. The moment stretched long enough for everyone in the room to feel its weight, and then, without another word, the owner shifted his posture and turned toward the center of the restaurant. He did not raise his hand for another server, did not call upon the maître d'. Instead, he himself extended his arm in quiet invitation. His gesture was not hurried, but deliberate, an acknowledgement that required no explanation. The woman, still clutching her coat against her side, hesitated only briefly before stepping forward. For the first time since she had entered the restaurant, the air around her felt less like resistance and more like open space. The owner walked beside her, not ahead of her, his pace steady, his eyes fixed forward, but with a presence that suggested protection as much as guidance. The murmur of the diners followed them, a hushed chorus of curiosity and disbelief. People craned their necks slightly, some shifting in their chairs to watch the path unfold. The waiter who had denied her stood frozen near the entrance, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, watching the scene unravel into something that left him invisible and irrelevant. At the center of the dining room, beneath a chandelier that spilled warm light across polished wood, stood a table that had been left open for no ordinary guest. It was the kind of table offered only to those whose names carried weight, those whose reputations preceded them. Tonight it was prepared for her. Crisp white cloth stretched over the surface, the folds perfectly pressed, and in the center stood a vase with a single long-stemmed lily. The silverware gleamed as though it had been polished moments earlier. Glasses aligned with mathematical precision, each detail a silent statement that she was not merely welcome but honored. The owner pulled out the chair himself, chair upholstered in deep red velvet that seemed to radiate against the muted tones of the room. He bowed his head slightly as he held it, the same humility in his posture as when he had lowered himself. Moments earlier, she slid into the seat slowly, her hands brushing against the armrests. Her coat finally placed carefully on the back of the chair. For the first time since stepping into the restaurant, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. The chair did not simply hold her body. It held the dignity she had been denied, now restored with deliberate reverence. The service that followed was unlike anything she could have anticipated. The maître d', face pale and voice subdued, approached with a menu embossed in gold lettering. He placed it in front of her with the deference that had been absent at her arrival. Came next, offering suggestions with a softness in his tone, as though aware that each word must be weighed carefully. Even the servers who passed near her table adjusted their pace. Moving with unusual care, their trays steadied, her glances respectful. The diners around her continued to watch, though now their eyes carried a different expression. Where there had been indifference or discomfort earlier, there was now something closer to admiration, even envy. They had witnessed the arc of her journey in this room, from dismissal to recognition, and they could not escape the knowledge of what it revealed. About themselves, some shifted awkwardly, their own silence heavy with the realization of complicity. Others nodded subtly, small acknowledgments that they understood the significance of what had just transpired. The woman unfolded the napkin and placed it across her lap, her movements calm and measured, every gesture reclaiming the ease that had been denied to her. The clinking of glasses and the soft hum of the piano returned to fill the room. But the atmosphere remained altered, shaped by the memory of what had just taken place. She no longer felt like an intruder forced into the corner. She was at the very heart of the restaurant, occupying the finest seat, a presence undeniable. The owner lingered by her side for a moment longer, ensuring that every detail was as it should be. He spoke quietly, his tone carrying the same sincerity. That had marked his bow. "This is where you belong tonight," he said. "Not because of me, not because of this place, but because it is your right to be honored." With that, he inclined his head once more before stepping back, though not without casting a firm glance toward his staff, a silent warning that the memory of this evening would not be forgotten. As she lifted her glass of water, the coolness against her fingers, she felt her heartbeat slow into steadiness. The sting of earlier humiliation still lingered faintly, but it no longer defined her. In its place was a quiet strength, the knowledge that the tables had turned, not just physically but symbolically. Where she had once been denied, she was now centered. Where she had been diminished, she was now elevated. The reversal was complete in every detail: the finest table, the best service, the most visible acknowledgement that her dignity was no longer in question. The music swelled softly in the background as she took her first sip, and though she said nothing, her silence spoke louder than any demand she could have made. It was the silence of arrival, of belonging, for wrong that had been not only corrected but transformed into a moment that no one present would ever forget. The sound of her chair settling into its place had hardly faded when the whispers began. They started at the tables nearest to hers, voices lowered to cautious murmurs, and then rippled outward like rings spreading across water. The chandelier above glimmered the same. The piano resumed its soft rhythm. Forks and knives scraped gently against porcelain, but the air had shifted into something charged and unsteady. Every clink of glass seemed to fall beneath the shadow of what had just unfolded at one table near the wall. A man leaned toward his companion, his voice pitched, low, though not low enough to escape notice. "Did you see that?" He bowed. His words carried a mixture of disbelief and something bordering on. The woman across from him shook her head slowly, her fingers circling the rim of her glass. "I've dined here for years," she whispered, "and I've never seen him bow to anyone. Not to a politician, not to a financier, not to anyone." Her eyes flicked toward the center of the room, where the woman now sat with quiet dignity at the finest table. Her expression softened into something that looked almost like approval. But not all whispers carried the same tone. At another table, closer to the entrance, a younger couple exchanged uneasy glances. The man stirred his soup, though he no longer seemed interested in eating it. "It was dramatic," he muttered, his lips tight, almost theatrical. His partner leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing. Dramatic, maybe, but wasn't it necessary? "Did you hear what he said about her father? About the fire?" The man shrugged, uncomfortable. Still to bow like that in front of everyone. His words trailed off. The implication lingered. Not everyone in the room approved of humility shown so openly, especially to someone they had moments before regarded as an outsider. The restaurant breathed with these divided responses. Rooms split between those who saw the moment as an overdue recognition and those who resisted its meaning. The soundscape itself reflected the tensions, small silences punctuated by bursts of hushed voices, cutlery tapping plates as if to fill the void. She sat at the center of it all, aware of the weight pressing in from every side. Though she could not hear every word, she could feel the hum of conversations brushing against her like invisible currents. Some of the stares she had felt earlier remained, but they had changed. Where once there had been suspicion and judgment, now there was curiosity, even recalibration. The very people who had silently endorsed her exclusion were now reshaping their narratives in real time, deciding whether to frame the moment as disruption or revelation. The owner's bow had made neutrality impossible. To dine in that room now was to choose a stance, even if unspoken. Each whisper betrayed a diner's alignment, the ones who spoke with reverence, acknowledging the courage of her father, and the ones who muttered with unease, unsettled by the inversion of hierarchies they had taken for granted. Near the piano, a group of older women leaned close to one another, their pearls catching the light as they exchanged words so quiet they were almost gestures. One of them nodded subtly in the woman's direction, her eyes soft, and whispered, "Her father saved lives, and she was turned away. That boy should be ashamed." Another shook her head, disapproval etched into her lined features. It should not have taken that story for her to be seen. She had a reservation. It should have been enough. The woman heard fragments, glimpses of these conversations, but she did not let them disturb her posture. She sat steady, napkin resting across her lap, her hands calm against the linen. She was not oblivious to the scrutiny. She simply refused to shrink beneath it. The waiter who had refused her lingered near the back, his ears catching the whispers more sharply than anyone else. Each fragment was another lash across his pride, the disapproval of the older women, the admiration in some voices, the uneasy doubts in others. No reprimand from his employer could have cut deeper than this collective hum, this chorus of judgment. That excluded him, while it elevated her. He had been the one with control only minutes earlier, and now he was the subject of murmurs he could not silence. The restaurant carried on in its rituals. Wine poured into glasses, plates cleared and replaced, but beneath the surface, every action seemed different. Every motion performed in awareness of the weight that had settled in the air. The unspoken history that hung between them, all the history of doors closed, of lives built and forgotten, of dignity denied and restored, was present at every table. Whether diners chose to acknowledge it or not, she sat with her back straight, hearing less the specific words and more the shape of what they meant. Approval or disapproval, curiosity or discomfort, none of it erased what had already been done. The bow, the recognition of her father, the reversal of humiliation, these had left a mark no whisper could undo. The clink of silverware, the muted conversations, the shifting of chairs, all of it now unfolded under that shadow. The weight of unspoken history was there in every glance, every murmur, every sip of wine. It hovered, undeniable, shaping the evening into something that none of them would forget. The room had been filled with whispers for so long that when she finally opened her mouth to speak, the sound of her voice startled even those who had been waiting for it. She did not raise it, she did not have to. The calm steadiness of her tone carried farther than volume ever could, and the weight of her words drew the diner's attention more sharply than the clink of any glass, or the melody of any piano. "I have been silent because I am used to silence," she began, her eyes steady on no one in particular, yet her presence commanding the attention of everyone. "Silence has been my companion in rooms where my worth was questioned before I had a chance to prove it. Silence has followed me into stores where clerks watched me more closely than their merchandise. It has waited at the edges of meetings, where my words were doubted before they were heard. And tonight, silence nearly swallowed me again." Her hands rested on the table, fingers relaxed, her posture neither defensive nor meek. She spoke with the kind of measured control that comes only from years of practice and weighing each word carefully, knowing how easily it could be twisted or dismissed. "I have learned," she continued, "that respect does not always arrive on its own. For some of us, it must be fought for, carried like an invisible shield, demanded even when the asking feels like a battle." The diners who had been leaning toward one another fell still, even those who had muttered uneasily at the owner's bow found themselves listening, their discomfort replaced by something harder to name. Her voice did not accuse, it did not condemn. It revealed calmly and without embellishment the cost of being unseen. She lifted her gaze then, not to the waiter who had refused her, not even to the owner who had bowed, but to the room itself. Her eyes traveled from table to table, taking in the faces that had stared, the ones that had looked away, the ones that now looked back at her with something like regret. "What happened here tonight is not new to me," she said, her tone steady. "It is not the first time I have been told I do not belong. It is not the first time someone decided comfort for others was more important than dignity for me. As different as that, tonight, the truth could not be buried under silence. Tonight, someone remembered, and that changes everything." The piano player had stopped again, his hands hovering above the keys, as if unwilling to break the spell. The waiter stood stiff at the edge of the room, his shame made sharper by the clarity of her words. The owner himself inclined his head slightly, not in interruption, but in acknowledgement. Granting her the space that had been denied to her only minutes earlier, she drew a breath, her chest rising and falling evenly, and continued, "I have fought for respect, not with fists, not with anger, but with persistence. With showing up again and again in places that told me I had no place. With holding my head high, even when every glance tried to push it down. My grandmother taught me that dignity is something you do not surrender, no matter how often it is tested. My father showed me through his hands, through the buildings he raised, that strength is quiet but enduring, and yet even carrying all. Of that, I have walked into rooms like this one and been told without words or with words sharpened in politeness that I should stand aside." Her voice did not waver, though the emotion beneath it was unmistakable. She was not asking for pity. She was bearing witness. Her truth stretched across the tablecloth like another place setting that could not be removed. "Respect should not be something fought for," she said finally, her eyes narrowing slightly as her gaze returned to her own glass. "It should be as natural as the air in this room, and yet here I am. Here we all are, learning again that the simple act of recognition can feel like a miracle." A silence followed her words that was deeper than any that had come before. No whisper dared intrude on it. No clink of cutlery tried to fill it. The weight of what she had spoken sank into the room like stone dropped in water, rippling outward, impossible to ignore. She had spoken without raising her voice, yet the truth in her words had made the chandeliers seem dimmer, the walls closer, the air heavier. She reached for her glass then, lifted it calmly, and took a slow sip. The gesture was unremarkable, ordinary even, but it carried the quiet authority of someone who had claimed her space and her voice would turn silence into testimony. The room remained hushed, every diner suspended in the gravity of what they had just heard. Each one left to wrestle privately with the knowledge that respect, so easily assumed for themselves, had been for her a battle fought every day. Her words had already stilled the room, but when she continued, her voice took on a softer depth, as though the weight of years was being gently laid out for the first time. She did not speak of herself with pride or self-congratulation. Instead, she spoke with the same quiet steadiness her father had carried into his work, a kind of humility that seemed to make her story even more arresting. "I have not lived a life of fame or wealth," she said, her fingers brushing the edge of the linen on the table. "I chose to live in service of others, in places where recognition rarely comes, but where it is needed most. I ain't been a teacher. For 30 years, I stood in classrooms where children came with tired eyes, hungry stomachs, and the weight of the world already pressing against their young shoulders. Some said they were too distracted, too broken to learn. I refused to believe that. I sat with them, one by one, even when the clock had run out, even when the lights of the building dimmed, and I watched them grow." She paused, her gaze flickering briefly as though she were seeing their faces even now. "I remember a boy named Terrence who used to fall asleep at his desk. Others thought he was lazy.
Ow.
I found out he stayed up at night caring for his younger brothers because his mother worked the night shift. I let him rest in my classroom, then taught him after the bell, slowly, patiently, until he could read the books everyone else assumed would always be closed to him. That boy is a lawyer now. He still writes to me." The diners listened in silence, forks unmoving, wine glasses untouched. The restaurant, usually filled with the hum of conversations about business, politics, and travel, now hung on the details of lives none of them had ever imagined. "I became more than a teacher in those years," she continued. "I became the one who knocked on doors when students stopped showing up. I stood in kitchens with mothers who felt alone, in hallways with fathers who had given up, reminding them their children deserved a chance. I organized food drives when my students were too hungry to think straight, built after-school programs with scraps of funding no one else wanted to bother with. I did what I could, even when I was told it wasn't enough. But every child who walked out of my classroom with their head a little higher, that was enough for me." Her voice grew steadier as she spoke, no longer weighted by hesitation. "And when the school closed because the district said it wasn't worth saving, I turned my attention to the community itself. We built a center in a church basement. Had no money, only determination. We started with donated chairs, folding tables, and hand-me-down books. But it became a place where children could come after school, where teenagers could learn skills, where parents could find guidance. We kept the lights on with bake sales, car washes, whatever it took.
Ouch.
And from that little basement, opportunities grew." She folded her hands gently in front of her, her gaze steady now on the owner, though her words were for everyone. "None of us do. But I gave myself fully to it, year after year, because I believe that dignity is not only something you protect for yourself, it is something you build for others, something you hand forward like a torch. And yet for all those years, my work lived in shadows. No newspaper wrote about it, no plaque bears my name. That has never been my concern. But too often, people looked at me and saw only what they assumed I could not be." Her tone softened again, a thread of weariness weaving through her steadiness. "That is the part that stings, to labor with all your heart and to watch others reap the recognition while you are told, quietly or bluntly, that your place is elsewhere. It happened in classrooms, in offices, and tonight, here, at this very door. But what I have built remains, whether anyone names it or not. Former students now stand as teachers, nurses, entrepreneurs. Parents tell me their children dream bigger, because someone once told them they could. That is my work. That is my life. And though it has not been adorned with titles or honors, it has mattered." A silence followed, heavy yet reverent, broken only by the faint hum of the piano's next chord. Her words had shifted the room again, peeling back the polished layers of privilege and expectation to reveal a truth that demanded to be felt. She had carried others forward quietly, just as her father had built the city's bones without praise, and now seated at the finest table. She finally spoke her story aloud. She lifted her glass of water once more, her movements calm, her eyes unshaken. "I am not here to be celebrated," she said, her voice clear and steady, "but I will not allow myself to be erased." And with that, the silence that followed was no longer one of discomfort but of respect, unspoken yet undeniable. The young waiter remained at the margins of the dining room, close enough to see her clearly, but far enough that no one could accuse him of intruding. His hands were clasped tightly behind his back, fingers twisting against one another as though they could absorb the tension running through him. He had stood in that spot many times before, overseeing guests, scanning for empty glasses or unspoken needs, but never had he felt so exposed, even in stillness. Tonight the room seemed to have turned against him, not with cruelty, but with judgment, its silence more severe than any reprimand. And in that silence, her voice carried every word she spoke about her life, about classrooms filled with tired children, about a church basement turned into a haven for learning struck against the shell he had built around himself. He had dismissed her at the door with a smile sharpened into refusal, convincing himself he was simply protecting standards, upholding what the restaurant demanded. But now those words sounded hollow, pitiful in the shadow of the truth spilling gently into the air. She was not an outsider grasping at entry where she did not belong. She was a woman who had given her years to raising others higher, who had shaped futures that would ripple long after she was gone. The waiter swallowed hard, his throat dry. He remembered his own childhood suddenly, though he had tried to tuck it away beneath the polish of adulthood. His mother had worked double shifts at a diner not unlike this one, though without the chandeliers and velvet chairs. He had done homework at sticky counters, waiting until she could finally take him home late at night. There had been teachers, one or two, not many, who stayed after hours, who pressed a hand to his shoulder when he fell behind, who told him he was capable even when exhaustion dragged him down. And as she spoke, he realized she was one of those people. She was the kind of person who carried others through without expecting thanks. And he had looked at her and seen only what he had been taught to see, someone unworthy of the finest tables. Curled in his stomach, heavier with each breath, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to stand tall, but the effort made him feel more small. The room's whispers had already condemned him in their own way, but it was not their judgment that cut deepest. It was hers not. Through accusation, not through anger, but through the undeniable truth of her existence. She did not need to look at him. Her story itself revealed the injustice of his actions, and that revelation stung more than if she had turned her gaze directly upon him and demanded explanation. He thought of the words he had used, polite, clipped, professional words that hid their sting behind courtesy. It told himself they were harmless, that he was simply guiding her to the appropriate space. But listening to her now, he knew those words had carried all the weight of every dismissal she had endured before. He had been one more voice in a long chorus telling her she did not belong. And yet she sat before him now, steady, unflinching. Her story filling the room with a dignity no polished uniform of his could match. The owner's bow had shaken him. It had torn away the safety of hierarchy he thought would protect him. But her words now did something more. They pierced the quiet pride he had in his own discipline, his own ambitions. He had thought success meant composure, the ability to enforce boundaries without flinching. But as she spoke of fighting for respect, of building opportunity with her bare hands, he realized how shallow his version of discipline had been. He enforced rules. She had built lives. His breath came unevenly as he tried to steady himself. He wanted to apologize, to step forward and spill out words of regret. But something held him back, the awareness that apology, if spoken now, might sound too easy, too convenient in the shadow of her story. So he stayed where he was, listening, letting each sentence chip away at the rigid shell he had built around his role. When she spoke of not allowing herself to be erased, something inside him twisted sharply. He thought of how he had nearly done. Just that, how close he had come to writing her out of the evening entirely, reducing her to a problem to be solved quietly at the door. He saw himself then not as a protector of standards, but as a participant in erasure. however small or polite. And he felt the weight of that realization settle over him like a stone. He would not be able to shake off easily. The piano resumed its gentle notes. The diners shifted again into murmured conversation. But the waiter remained at the edge of the room, still listening. His face no longer held the stiff mask of confidence it had earlier. His features softened into something closer to remorse, his eyes lowered not in defiance but in humility. He could not undo what had been done, but he could not forget it either. Her words had reshaped him, chiseling away at the illusions he had carried, leaving him raw, exposed, and aware of how small he had been in the presence of someone far greater than he had. Recognized, the owner had stood silently through her words. His posture steady, but his face marked with something that looked heavier than simple regret. When the last of her sentences faded into the quiet, he remained near her table, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, as though steadying himself. The room's whispers had ebbed, replaced by a hush so complete that even the faint hum of the air conditioner could be heard above the piano's hesitant notes. Then, after a long pause, his voice broke the silence, deep and deliberate, carrying a weight that pulled every eye toward him once more. "What I did a moment ago," he said slowly, "bowing before you, that was not enough." His words startled the room, their blunt honesty more striking than a polished speech could have been. He turned his gaze not only to her, but also to the diners watching, his eyes sweeping across the velvet chairs and the candlelit tables. "One gesture cannot erase what happened at this door tonight, nor can it erase what has happened countless times before. In this city, in this world, in places where dignity is treated like a privilege instead of a birthright." The woman sat steady, her hands folded loosely in her lap, her face calm but attentive. I'd not asked for more than acknowledgement, yet here he was, insisting upon it. "I built this restaurant," continued, his voice gaining strength, as though speaking aloud what he had long carried in silence, to represent refinement, care, and excellence. But what good is excellence if it excludes? What good is refinement if it humiliates the very people it should honor? I see now that I have allowed the trappings of prestige to blind me. I let myself believe that what happened outside my sight was not my responsibility. Tonight has reminded me that it is. This house carries my name, and if my staff or my standards wound someone at its doors, then that wound belongs to me as well. Young waiter shifted again in the shadows, his face tightening as the words pressed against him like a second rebuke. Diners leaned closer, some frowning, some nodding, but none daring to interrupt. The owner spoke with the kind of conviction that demanded silence. He stepped closer to her table, his hand brushing against the linen as though anchoring himself to the truth he was laying down. "I cannot pay back what your father gave me when he carried my family from the fire. I cannot repay the years of work you have given to children and families who needed you more than this city ever acknowledged. I can change this house. I can make certain that what happened tonight does not happen again, not to you, not to anyone who walks through these doors." His voice lowered, but the intensity in it sharpened. "From this day forward, this restaurant will not only serve fine meals, it will serve as a place of welcome, of fairness, of dignity. No guest will be judged unworthy of its tables. More than that, part of what we earn here will go back into the community you've described, to schools, into programs, into the very work you have carried on your shoulders alone. That is the least I can do. If this house is to represent anything under my name, it must represent justice. Die." The weight of his words seemed to ripple outward. Diners who had moments earlier whispered uneasily now sat still, their gazes shifting. Their expressions softened into something like respect. The piano player stopped again, his hands resting quietly on the keys, unwilling to break the solemnity of the vow being spoken. The woman regarded him silently. She had not asked for charity, nor had she demanded restitution, but she recognized sincerity when she heard it, and in his voice was something raw, something stripped of performance. He was not speaking to impress the diners or to protect his reputation. He was speaking to repay a debt that stretched beyond money, beyond pride, beyond even this night. The owner's eyes met hers, steady, unwavering. You deserve more than an apology. You deserve to know that this place will no longer be a door that closes, but a door that opens. That is my promise to you, and it is my promise to everyone who will ever sit at one of these tables." The silence that followed was almost reverent. The woman did not rush to respond. She let his words settle over the room, their weight pressing into the chandeliers, the polished wood, the very foundation of the restaurant itself. She lifted her glass of water and took a slow sip, her gaze never breaking from his. And though she spoke no word, the quiet strength in her eyes made clear that she heard him, that she would remember, and that it was now on him to keep the vow he had dared to make before all who watched. The first dish arrived, not with the usual flourish of waiters rehearsed in elegance, but with a quiet care that made the act feel transformed. A silver tray appeared at her table, carried not by the young man who had once turned her away, but by a senior server whose hands trembled slightly, as if aware that this was no ordinary service. He set the plate before her with deliberate precision, his eyes lowering not out of duty but out of recognition. On the porcelain rested a meal prepared with artistry glazed vegetables arranged like painted strokes, tender meat sliced so finely it seemed almost ceremonial. Yet tonight it was not the food itself that mattered, it was the way it was offered. The weight of intention behind each movement. The chefs, usually hidden behind the wall of the kitchen, stepped forward and turned. One emerged, his apron crisp, and his face marked with years of labor over flame. He nodded once toward her, a subtle gesture. But in that nod was the acknowledgement of a craftsman who understood that his work had been given a new purpose. Another chef followed, a younger woman with flour dust still clinging to her sleeve. She set a small basket of bread on the table as though placing an offering, her eyes soft with something that looked almost like gratitude. The meal unfolded course by course, each dish arriving with a hush that seemed to ripple outward across the room. Diners who normally paid little mind to the movements of staff now watched intently, their conversations subdued, their gestures softened. The act of eating together, once ordinary, became something closer to reverence. Glasses of wine were lifted with a kind of hesitation, as if to drink too loudly might disrupt the solemn rhythm that had overtaken the evening. She sat with composure, her hands steady as she lifted her fork, tasting each bite slowly. Not out of hunger, but out of respect for what was being offered. The flavors were rich, layered with care, but they were not what filled her most. It was the atmosphere, the sense that every person in the room now carried awareness of what this meal represented. She had entered a place that had tried to deny her, and now, seated at the finest table, she was not only welcomed, but honored. Around her, the diners began to shift in tone. A man at the next table leaned toward his companion, speaking softly, but without the sharp edge of judgment that had marked his earlier whispers. "It feels different tonight," he said, almost to himself, as though the food is not the point anymore. His companion nodded, her eyes still on the woman at the center. "It never was," she murmured. Farther across the room, another guest, a woman in pearls, caught the eye of a server and requested to pay for the dessert of a table. She did not know. It was a small act, but it carried with it the same spirit that now threaded itself through the restaurant, a recognition that generosity had been absent for too long. The piano, which had faltered in and out throughout the night, began again, with a different tone. The notes were softer, more reflective, the melody lingering between chords, as though each sound wanted to bow as well. The pianist, usually ignored by diners focused on their plates, now became part of the ceremony, its music weaving itself into the reverence that had overtaken the room. The woman ate slowly, not rushing through the courses. She did not need to speak. Her presence alone gave the meal its meaning. She lifted her glass occasionally, her eyes calm, and each time she did, servers adjusted their pace, diners lowered their voices, as though her movements set the rhythm of the room itself. The meal had ceased to be about consumption. It had become a communion, a shared acknowledgement that dignity, once denied, had been restored in the most visible way. Even the young waiter who lingered in the shadows could not escape the transformation. He watched each dish delivered to her table with a tightening in his chest, realizing that what he had once denied her was not simply a seat, but this moment a meal that had become larger than food, larger than service, larger even than the restaurant itself. He knew, as did everyone else, that they were witnessing something unforgettable. When dessert finally arrived, a delicate confection dusted with sugar and framed by fresh fruit, the room seemed to pause altogether. The server placed it before her with both hands, as though presenting a gift, and for a moment no one moved. She picked up her spoon, broke the surface lightly, and tasted it. Only then did the sound of silverware resume across the room, as if her action had given permission for the night to continue. The meal ended not with applause, not with fanfare, but with silence that carried more weight than any ovation. Diner knew they had been part of something that transcended the rituals of fine dining. The food had been excellent, as always, but it was no longer what would be remembered. What lingered was the reverence, the quiet transformation of a meal into an act of respect. The recognition that a woman once denied her place had sat at the center and reminded them all of what true dignity looked like. When the meal had come to its quiet end, when the last notes of the piano had dissolved into the air and the diners began returning to their hushed conversations, the young waiter remained at the periphery of the room. He had stood there for what felt like hours, invisible but restless. Every word she had spoken still pressing heavily against him. The story of her father, the story of her work, the grace with which she had borne humiliation, each one had cut deeper than any reprimand from his employer could. His polished shoes no longer gave him confidence. His uniform, pressed so neatly at the beginning of the evening, felt more like a costume hiding his uncertainty. He knew he could not leave the night as it was. He had to face her, though shame made his feet heavy and his chest tight. When most of the guests had turned back to their wine and desserts, when the weight of the spectacle had eased into something softer, he finally stepped forward. His walk was slow, hesitant, nothing like the confident strides with which he had denied her earlier. Each step seemed to echo louder in his own mind than in the room itself. He stopped at her table, his hands clasped before him, and cleared his throat, though the sound nearly caught. She lifted her eyes toward him, calm, unreadable, giving nothing away. His voice faltered, and he lowered his gaze. The words that had come so easily before, the clipped, polished phrases of professional courtesy, now seemed impossible to summon. He swallowed hard and tried again, softer this time, the practiced mask stripped away. I owe you an apology, a real one. The room did not still the way it had when the owner spoke. But those seated nearby turned their heads subtly, aware of the moment unfolding. The waiter shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders tense, but he pressed forward. When you came in tonight, I looked at you and decided you didn't belong here. I told myself I was protecting the standards of this place, but really, I was protecting nothing but my own assumptions. I saw only what I wanted to see, not who you are, not what you carry, and I hurt you for it. His voice trembled, but he did not stop. Hearing you speak, hearing about the lives you've touched, the things you've built. He paused, his throat tightening, his eyes flicking upward for only a second before lowering again. I realize how wrong I was. I've given more to people than I can imagine giving in my lifetime, and I treated you as if you were less than the name on a reservation. I can't take that back, but I can tell you that I will not forget it. I will not make that mistake again. She remained silent for a moment, studying him. Her expression did not harden, but neither did it soften into easy forgiveness. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, the kind that made him feel as though she could see straight through his apology and into the truth of his heart. He shifted, again his hands tightening against one another, the silence stretching long enough to make his face burn. I'm sorry, he repeated, the words now stripped to their barest form. Without excuse, without performance. Truly sorry? For what? I did, for what I assumed. The woman's lips parted, her voice measured, even without malice, but without indulgence either. It isn't me you failed, she said quietly. It is yourself. Every time you let judgment guide you, you diminish yourself before you diminish me. Remember that. Her words struck him harder than any scolding could have. His eyes glistened as he nodded quickly. Unable to form a proper reply, she did not dismiss him harshly, nor did she absolve him. She simply gave him the truth. Placing the weight back on his own shoulders where it belonged, he stepped back slowly, bowing his head, the heat of shame still burning in his chest, but mingled now with something else, a determination he had not known before. He would not erase this night, but he could allow it to shape him. He could let the lesson settle so deeply that it would alter the way he saw every person who walked through the restaurant's doors from now on. As he returned to the shadows, he no longer held the posture of a polished professional. He moved, with humility, his steps quieter, his face more open. He had been broken open by her dignity, by her story, by his own failure revealed in stark relief. But in that breaking, something had shifted. He understood now that respect was not a courtesy to be rationed out, but a foundation. The first offering given freely before anything else. The woman turned back to her table, lifting her glass again, her face calm, unchanged. She had not asked for his apology, nor did she require it to validate her presence. But he knew, deep in his chest, that he would carry her words forward like a mark that could not fade. And in that quiet space, with the clinking of silverware resuming around them, his redemption began not in her forgiveness, but in his resolve never to deny another soul the dignity that was their due. The restaurant had begun to exhale again, its rhythm slowly returning to something like normal, though nothing about the night would ever be ordinary again. Plates were cleared quietly, glasses refilled with care, and conversations, though hushed, began to flow once more around the room. Yet at her table, there lingered a weight that refused to dissipate. The owner had not moved far from her side. He stood with his hand resting lightly on the back of a nearby chair, his eyes distant, as though chasing a memory across decades. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. His fingers trembled faintly, not with weakness, but with the gravity of what he was about to reveal. He drew out a worn leather wallet, not the polished accessory of a wealthy man, but something older, softened with years of use. From it, he pulled a thin envelope, edges yellowed with time, and carefully withdrew what lay inside. He held the object in his hand for a long moment, before setting it gently on the table before her. It was a photograph, its surface slightly bent, the colors faded but still strong enough to carry the presence of a man she knew at once. Her breath caught, her fingers hovering just above it before she dared to touch. It was her father, younger. Then she remembered him, his shoulders straight, his eyes steady, captured in a candid moment where he seemed unaware of the camera. The room seemed to contract around her, the sounds of forks and murmured voices fading into the distance. All she could see was that photograph, fragile yet enduring, a fragment of the man who had shaped her life. Her throat tightened, and her vision blurred with tears she tried to hold back. She had no memory of this image, no knowledge that it even existed. And yet here it was, placed before her after all these years, like a gift carried forward through fire and time to reach her hands in this moment. The owner's voice was low, carrying the timbre of confession. "This was taken the day after the fire," he said, his eyes fixed not on her, but on the image. "I don't know who captured it. Perhaps a neighbor, perhaps someone passing by. But it found its way to me. I kept it, not because I deserved to, but because I could not let go of what he had done. My father, my mother, myself, we owed our lives to him, and this photograph became a reminder I carried through the years. Every time I doubted, every time I grew too proud, I looked at it. It told me there were men greater than I could ever hope to be, men like him." Her hand trembled as she finally touched the photograph, her fingertips brushing the faded surface with a tenderness that spoke of both longing and recognition. "I've never seen this," she whispered, her voice breaking softly. "He never told us there was a picture. He never spoke of that night at all." The owner nodded slowly. He wouldn't have. He was that kind of man. He did what had to be done, then carried on quietly. But I could not forget. I kept this for decades, not knowing why. Perhaps for this day, perhaps because I always knew that one day I would need to place it back where it belongs. The diners nearby sensed the shift, their whispers falling away as they realized something intimate was unfolding. The young waiter, still lingering at the edges, lowered his gaze. Humbled once more by the weight of a story that reached far beyond his own understanding, she cradled the photograph in both hands now, her tears slipping down her cheeks without shame. In that moment, she felt her father's presence so vividly, it was as if he were seated across from her. His silence, no longer a burden, but a legacy she could hold. For years she had carried only memories, incomplete and fading at the edges. Now she held proof, an image that stitched together the fragments of his life with the stories she had heard. With the man she had known? The owner straightened slightly, though his voice carried the same humility as before. I should have returned it long ago. I was not ready to face what it meant. Tonight, I see clearly. It was never mine to keep. It belongs to you, to your family, to the memory of the man who gave us all more than we could ever repay. Her chest ached with gratitude and grief intertwined, a swell of emotions she could not shape into words. She simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the photograph, her fingers holding it as though afraid it might vanish if she let go. The restaurant, with all its chandeliers and polished wood, faded around her. What remained was the face of her father, his image preserved against all odds, waiting across years of silence to find its way back to her hands. In that moment, the night's humiliations, its revelations, its promises, all of it wove together into something unshakable. She was no longer only the woman who had been denied a table. She was the daughter of a man remembered, honored, and finally returned. To her, in the form of a gift that had endured where words had failed, and as she held the photograph close, the weight of his legacy felt lighter. Not because it had diminished, but because she no longer carried it alone. The tears came before she could stop them, rising not from the sting of humiliation, but from the tide of something far heavier, far deeper. Her hands shook as they clutched the photograph, the edges worn and fragile between her fingers. The image itself blurred slightly by the moisture that welled in her eyes. She had long since grown accustomed to swallowing her feelings, too, holding her head high in rooms where others tried to lower it for her. But tonight, as she sat at the finest table in the restaurant that had moments earlier tried to deny her, the weight that broke through her composure was not sorrow. It was recognition, raw, unexpected, and overwhelming. She bowed her head slightly, her shoulders trembling, her breath coming in uneven waves. All around her, the room stilled once more. Diners who had whispered, who had judged, who had watched her with disinterest now found themselves silent witnesses to something they could not turn away from. It was not pity they saw in her tears, but truth. It's the kind of truth that demands stillness, that pulls the air from a room until everyone present feels the gravity of it. She wept for her father, a man who had carried stone and fire with the same quiet resilience, whose strength had never been celebrated by the world he helped build. She wept because his image had been returned to her, not by family, not by those closest to him, but by a man who had carried the memory of his courage in secret for decades. To see her father, not as an invisible worker, not as just another laborer, but as a lifesaver, a hero remembered that recognition lifted something. Inside her, she had not even realized she carried. For years she had borne the silent ache of watching others erase men like him, hearing their names fade into nothing, while buildings rose as monuments to someone else's vision. She had carried that legacy quietly, honoring him in her own way, yet always knowing how rarely the world paused to remember.
Nice.
And now, in this unlikely place, his worth had been spoken aloud. His face placed in her hands, his life acknowledged in a room that had once tried to erase hers. The injustice of the evening, sharp as it had been, seemed to dissolve beneath the larger weight of this recognition. Her tears flowed freely now, though she did not hide them. She let them fall, streaking her cheeks, soaking the napkin she finally raised to dab gently against her skin. She did not weep for the insult of a waiter's refusal, for she had known insults before and endured them without allowing them to break her spirit. No, these tears belonged to the unexpected gift of dignity restored. They belonged to the realization that her father's sacrifices had not disappeared into silence, that her family's story had not been erased, that she herself was seen, fully, and without question, In this moment, the owner remained near her, his eyes lowered, giving her the privacy of her grief while allowing the rest of the room to witness. He did not interrupt, did not speak. He understood that this was not a moment for him to fill, but one for her to claim. The staff, too, moved quietly, their footsteps lighter than usual, their gestures stripped of routine polish, and instead waited. With respect, even the young waiter, still in the shadows, bowed his head slightly, not in imitation of his employer, but in genuine humility, humbled by the sight of her tears and what they meant. The diners, once so ready to glance away now, sat with hands resting on tables, their own eyes glistening, some with shame, some with empathy. The meal before them had grown cold, but none seemed eager to return to it. They had been drawn into something larger than themselves, something that reminded them that dignity, once recognized, has the power to transform even the most unlikely spaces. She lifted the photograph once more, holding it closer to her chest, though anchoring herself in the presence of her father. Her breath steadied, her tears still falling, but they came now with a sense of release. The burden she had carried, of always fighting to prove worth, of always wondering if the world would ever see beyond its assumptions, seemed to loosen. She had not expected this evening to become a reckoning. And yet here it was, a turning point, carved not from protest or demand, but from recognition freely given and publicly shared. As she wiped her cheeks, her lips parted in the faintest smile, small but resolute. It was not the smile of someone appeased, nor of someone comforted with gestures alone. It was the smile of someone who had finally been given what she had long deserved, acknowledgement that her life, her family, her bloodline carried weight that no denial could erase. The tears slowed, though the light in her eyes remained wet, gleaming against the glow of the chandelier. She placed the photograph carefully on the table, her hand resting over it as though promising her father she would carry this moment forward. And in that simple act, the weight of the years, the silences, the humiliations, the endless battles for respect lifted, not completely, but enough to let her breathe differently. Enough to let her sit at that table, not as a guest grudgingly accepted, but as a woman rooted in dignity that could no longer be denied. When the evening finally drew to its natural close, the air in the restaurant still carried a quiet reverence. As though the chandeliers themselves had absorbed the weight of what had unfolded, the woman rose slowly from her seat, the photograph of her father held carefully in her hand. She slipped her coat over her shoulders with deliberate grace, not as a shield against the chill of the night, but as a final gesture of composure. The eyes of the room followed her, not with the intrusive judgment she had felt when she first walked in, but with something entirely different, an acknowledgement, almost a gratitude, for the role she had played in reshaping the very air they breathed. The owner stepped forward again, bowing his head once more, but without words this time. His earlier vow had already filled the room. Repetition was unnecessary. His silence was its own kind of respect, granting her departure the dignity it deserved. Staff members stood straighter as she passed, their faces subdued, their movements stripped of performance. Even the young waiter, who lingered at the edge of her path, lowered his gaze as she walked by. He did not dare to speak, but his posture bore the humility of someone marked permanently by what had transpired. She crossed the room at a steady pace, her heels clicking lightly against the polished floor. Each step felt different now.
Where?
Earlier, they had been weighted with uncertainty. Burdened by the sting of exclusion, they now carried her with a quiet strength, each movement echoing the truth she had spoken aloud. She felt not only her father's presence at her side, but also the presence of her grandmother, her students, her community, every voice that had ever been silenced by doubt or dismissal. Tonight, in this unlikely place, those voices had been given room to breathe. The diners parted slightly in their chairs as she passed, a subtle shift, but one that spoke volumes. It was not the clearing of space for someone to leave. It was the kind of movement made when people recognize that they are in the presence of something larger than themselves. Some lowered their eyes, others offered small nods, but all of them felt the pull of what they had witnessed. They had come for fine dining, for an evening of indulgence. but they would leave with something heavier, something that would follow them long after the taste of the meal had faded. As she reached the doorway, she paused for a brief moment. She turned her head slightly, not to address anyone in particular, but to let her gaze sweep the room one last time. In that glance, there was no anger, no triumph, no bitterness. There was only steadiness, the kind that comes when a burden has shifted. When years of invisibility are interrupted by a moment of undeniable recognition. She allowed herself a single breath there, holding the photograph close. Before stepping into the night, the air outside was cool, the city lights casting a glow against the pavement. She inhaled deeply, the crispness filling her lungs, and for the first time in a long while, she felt lighter, not because the world had changed completely, had not. And she knew it, but because something had shifted, however small. Dignity had been acknowledged in a place where it had once been denied, and that acknowledgement would ripple outward. Inside, the restaurant did not return immediately to its old self. Conversations resumed, but their tone was altered, tinged with reflection. Diners spoke of what they had seen, not in the gossipy way of recounting drama, but in the contemplative way of people suddenly aware that they had been part of something worth remembering. Some asked themselves uncomfortable questions. Others simply sat quietly, letting the lessons sink in. The young waiter remained still, his thoughts loud in his silence, knowing that nothing about the way he approached his role could remain the same. The owner stood taller, not in pride, but in renewed responsibility, determined that his vow would not fade when the night did. For her, to walk down the street was steady, her steps carrying the weight of memory and the lift of release. She thought of her father, of how he had given his strength to others without demanding gratitude. And she felt that tonight, at last, his quiet labor had been honored in the open. She thought of her students, of the community she had built. And she knew that their struggles carried worth that could never be erased. She thought of herself, of the countless times she had fought for respect, and she realized that this night had not erased those battles, but it had given them meaning. They had brought her here. By the time she turned the corner and the restaurant lights disappeared from view, she carried with her not only a photograph but a certainty that respect, once extended sincerely, has the power to alter everything. It had changed the owner. It had changed the waiter. It had changed the diners. And it had, in some unspoken way, changed her too. What began as a humiliation ended as a quiet revolution, proof that the smallest act of recognition, offered at the right moment, could reshape an entire room and, perhaps, with time, the world beyond its walls.